This is Land of Havilah, Leviticus 21. Yahweh will now address the priesthood about keeping themselves ceremonially clean. He requires a little bit more from the priest than from the general population, and even more for the high priest. Verse 1. Yahweh said to Moses, Speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, A priest shall not defile himself for the dead among his people, except for his relatives that are near to him, for his mother, for his father, for his son, for his daughter, for his brother, and for his virgin sister who is near to him, who has had no husband. For her he may defile himself. He shall not defile himself, being a chief man among his people, to profane himself. Comment: the fact that a dead human body is ceremonially unclean catches us a little off guard because Yahweh hasn't said so yet. He'll say it later in Numbers 19:11, that anyone who touches a dead human body will be unclean 7 days. Jesus referred to this when he said to the Pharisees, You're like whitened tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but inward are full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. Matthew 23:27. And he said to them, quote, You're like hidden graves, and the men who walk over them don't know it. Luke 11:44. It seems from these passages and others that a dead human body was the height of uncleanness. Death first appeared when Adam and Eve rebelled from God, which brought a curse on themselves and on creation, Genesis 2:17. Death is an enemy of man and God. Speaking of Christ, quote, He must reign until he's put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be abolished is death, 1 Corinthians 15:25 and 26. Notice in that verse that death is Christ's enemy. So in the uncleanness of death, we see once again that many, if not all, the ceremonially unclean conditions were connected to the fall of Genesis. The fall corrupted man and creation. When Yahweh declared anything to be unclean, he was in some sense disowning it. In verses 1 to 3, a priest shouldn't defile himself by touching or tending to a dead body, but it was okay if it was an immediate family member. Still speaking of the priests, verse 5, They shall not shave their heads or shave off the corners of their beards or make any cuttings in their flesh. They shall be holy to their God and not profane the name of their God, for they offer the offerings of Yahweh made by fire, the bread of their God, therefore they shall be holy. Comment: the altar was Yahweh's table, so to speak, and the offerings going up on it were his bread. He had communion with his people through the altar. He didn't want his servants, who attended his table, simultaneously tending to dead bodies, as a rich man might not want his servant to come in from burying somebody straight to serving him at his table. Still speaking of the priest, verse 7, They shall not marry a woman who is a prostitute or profane. They shall not marry a woman divorced from her husband, for he's holy to his God. You shall sanctify him, therefore, for he offers the bread of your God. He shall be holy to you, for I, Yahweh, who sanctify you, am holy. Comment: in verse 7, Yahweh wanted to distance himself from prostitutes, profanity, and divorce. He said, I hate divorce. Malachi 2:16. Verse 9, The daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself by playing the prostitute, she profanes her father. She shall be burned with fire. Comment: this is probably Yahweh's strongest statement against prostitution. A priest's daughter who turns to prostitution shall be burned with fire. Now concerning the high priest, which is Aaron right now, verse 10, He who is the high priest among his brothers, upon whose head the anointing oil is poured, and that is consecrated to put on the garments, shall not let the hair of his head hang loose or tear his clothes. Comment: if someone let the hair of his head hang loose and tore his clothes, it indicated there was some sort of tragedy, such as a death in the family. Leviticus 10:6. In this passage, Yahweh is distancing himself from all death and tragedy, and from the fall in general, by saying that the high priest shouldn't at any time demonstrate tragedy. God will eventually abolish all the effects of the fall. Quote, Death will be no more, neither will there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more. The first things have passed away. Revelation 21:4. The first things are all the regrettable things around us, but restoration is coming. Now still speaking of the high priest, verse 11, He must not go into any dead body or defile himself for his father or for his mother. He shall not go out of the sanctuary nor profane the sanctuary of his God, for the crown of the anointing oil of his God is upon him. I am Yahweh. Comment: at the top of the chapter, Yahweh said a priest could attend a body if it was immediate family, but in verse 11, not the high priest. He shouldn't attend any dead body. In verse 12, he shall not go out of the sanctuary, meaning he shall not defile himself at any time. He's a picture of the undefiled Christ. Verse 13, he shall take a wife in her virginity, a widow or one divorced or a woman who has been defiled or a prostitute he shall not marry, but a virgin of his own people shall he take as wife. He shall not profane his offspring among his people, for I am Yahweh who sanctifies them. Comment: Paul said to the church in Corinth, quote, I married you to one husband that I may present you as a pure virgin to Christ, 2 Corinthians 11:2. So again in verses 13 to 15, the high priest is a further picture of Christ that he can marry a virgin only. Now speaking of all the priests, verse 16, Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, say to Aaron, none of your offspring throughout their generations who has a defect may approach to offer the bread of his God. For whatever man he is that has a defect, he shall not draw near. A blind man, or a lame, or he who has a flat nose, or any deformity, or a man who has an injured foot, or an injured hand, or hunchbacked, or a dwarf, or one who has a defect in his eye, or an itching disease, or scabs, or who has damaged testicles, no man of the offspring of Aaron the priest who has a defect shall come near to offer the offerings of Yahweh made by fire. Since he has a defect, he shall not come near to offer the bread of his God. He shall eat the bread of his God, both of the most holy and of the holy. He shall not come near to the veil, nor come near to the altar, because he has a defect, that he may not profane my sanctuaries, for I am Yahweh who sanctifies them. So Moses spoke to Aaron and to his sons and to all the children of Israel. Comment: in verses 17 to 23, no priest with a defect shall approach to offer the bread of his God. In other words, he shouldn't put anything on the altar. And in verse 23, he shall not come near the veil. But in verse 22, he can eat the bread of God. In other words, he can eat the priest portions of the meal offerings and of the sacrifices, even the ones that are most holy. The most holy offerings should be eaten in the sanctuary, Leviticus 10:17, which meant anywhere in the court, and maybe in the tent also, as long as he didn't get too close to the veil. So a defect didn't disqualify him totally. Just as every sacrifice symbolized Christ and must therefore be without defect, a priest who offered the sacrifice symbolized Christ as well, therefore he must be without defect in verses 16 to 23. In the law of Moses, the sacrifices made atonement, so they were pictures of Christ, but a sacrifice wasn't a legitimate sacrifice unless a priest offered it. Speaking of the priest, Leviticus has said over and over again that he makes atonement, as in chapter 4, verse 20, quote, and the priest shall make atonement for them, and they shall be forgiven, end quote. So the sacrifice made atonement, and the priest made atonement, but it took both. Both must be without defect, the sacrifice and the priest, because that's the way it was with Christ. He was our sacrifice without defect, and he was the priest without defect who offered it. Even if we Christians could qualify as movie stars or fashion models, our bodies will dishonor us at some point. Speaking of one's body being placed in the grave, quote, it's sown in dishonor, 1 Corinthians 15:43. But in the same verse, it's raised in glory. Christ was without physical defect that we know, but that's not to say he was unusually attractive. Isaiah said in prophecy of him, quote, he has no good looks or majesty. When we see him, there's no beauty that we should desire him. Chapter 53, verse 2. Leviticus 22 is next at landofhavilah.net.